Good evening. My name is Pauline Leven. I'm a professor in the Department of Classics and co-organizer of the Parry Lecture, along with my wonderful colleague, Ayesha Ramachandran, who is somewhere over there. It's an honor and a delight to welcome you all to the 10th annual Anne Emery and Adam Parry Lecture. A few words before I introduce tonight's speaker. First, we are very lucky to have benefited from the help of Lisa Tomlin, administrator in Complet, who has organized all the logistics of Joe's visit, or I should say her odyssey, because it was not easy coming to New Haven, and who has arranged for the lovely reception to which you're all invited after the talk. We're also grateful to the Classics and Complet departments for sponsoring this lecture. Now, more practically, every year at this time of year, even on this day for the Parry Lecture, the weather turns unseasonably warm, and we've had fainting incidents in the room. So please feel free to take your jackets off or whatever needs to happen so that you don't faint. Also, this event is being recorded, so if you could please make sure your cell phones and electronic devices are turned off, that would make for an even nicer recording for posterity. Second, I need to say a little bit about the series to which tonight's lecture belongs. The Parry Lecture initiative started 10 years ago and aims to highlight the work of scholars of ancient literature and culture who excel in the methods and talents that were once so beautifully exemplified by Anne Emery and Adam Parry, whose pictures are hanging over there. The thoughtful and detailed analysis of Greek and Latin texts, as well as the further receptions of those texts in ways that are at once adventurous, elegantly written, and critically informed. Those are the examples that they set for us. The Bingham Library is the right place for this lecture. It houses the books that once belonged to Anne Emery and Adam Parry, as well as the PhD dissertations of just some of the many students whom the dynamic husband and wife pair would have worked with in the late 60s and early 70s before meeting that tragic simultaneous end in a motorcycle accident in 1971. Both Anne and Adam were leading scholars of Homer and Homeric criticism, as well as the study of other ancient texts, especially Thucydides and Vergil. It is in the spirit of their wide-ranging and exciting scholarship that we invited for the formal inaugural lecture Joseph Rousseau, a proud former colleague and protege of both Anne Emery and Adam Parry. And it is with equal commitment to that spirit that we hosted last year the poet and translator A.E. Stallings, now professor of poetry at Oxford. And she took us all on a wild ride to 1921 Smyrna, following in the footsteps of T.S. Eliot and his pocket full of currants, if you remember. Today, we are honored to welcome Josephine Quinn. I have to say that Ayesha and I have been working on this lecture for nearly 2 years now, and we've exchanged many emails with Jo. This is not only because we're both great fans of her scholarship, but also because there are many other people who are great fans, and Professor Quinn is much in demand. But it was very much worth waiting for. Professor Quinn is professor of history at Oxford and works on Mediterranean history and archaeology, with particular interests in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, the Phoenicians, and ancient North Africa. She has written articles on topics from Roman imperialism to Athenian sculpture to Numidian architecture to Edwardian education, and co-edited volumes of essays on the Hellenistic West with Jonathan Prague, the Punic Mediterranean with Nicholas Vella, as well as the collected articles of the late Peter de Roo with Andrew Erskine. Her penultimate book, In Search of the Phoenicians, was published by Princeton University Press in January 2018, and this is what Ayesha and I knew before when we initially invited her. But she has since published another book, soon to be available in the USFA, How the World Made the West, published by Bloomsbury in February 24. This latest book has already been called a bold and magisterial work of immense scope and a work of great confidence, empathy, learning, and imagination. It argues that the real story of the West is much bigger than this established paradigm leads us to believe. Moving from the Bronze Age to the Age of Exploration, How the World Made the West reveals a new narrative, one that traces the millennia of global encounters and exchange that built what is now called the West, as societies met, tangled, and sometimes grew apart. Tonight, Professor Quinn will present the 10th Parry Lecture on the topic of African Dido in Colonial Mythscapes. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Pauline, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to you and Aisha for working so long on bringing me here, and to Lisa for facilitating that so marvellously, and to all of you for coming. And I'm really grateful to you for taking time out on this beautiful day to come to this very beautiful room. I don't think I've ever given a lecture in such a gorgeous space. So I'm really absolutely delighted as well as honoured to be here today. So I want to start on the coast of Tunisia, where in 1815, Turner imagined Dido building Carthage with some pretty impressive architecture for the 9th century BCE. And a beautiful woman striding here along the shore, inspecting the works. A wild, brave Tyrian princess named Elissa, or Elishat, or Theosso, or Dido, which is what I'll call her in this lecture, since that's what we usually call her. And she has meant different things to different people over the years. Just two examples from 16th century France and 21st century Belgium. But what I want to talk about here, of course, is what she meant in antiquity, and in particular in the context of colonialism. I won't be the first to worry at this question. Plenty of scholars have connected Vergil's Dido, in particular, with foreign impediments to Roman Empire, and especially with Cleopatra. Elena Giusti has recently made a subtle argument about the way that Vergil, again, aligns both Dido and Carthage more generally with other Eastern powers, such as Persia and Troy. And I have myself in the past discussed Dido's role in the construction of Carthaginian imperial ideology in the Western Mediterranean. But today, I want to look beyond existing interpretations of her legend in these broader imperial contexts to her meanings in Africa itself, and under the more specifically colonial settler power of first Carthage and then Rome. And I should say before I begin that one of the reasons I'm so glad to have the opportunity to discuss these matters here at Yale is that my own understanding of the Western Mediterranean and its mythscapes, the mythscapes that Dido inhabits, is heavily indebted to the remarkable work that Andrew Johnston has done on the myths of Gaul and Iberia, drawing our attention to stories from local cultures that had long been hiding in plain sight. And this is part of a wider move in recent years to reclaim ancient Mediterranean myth and legend beyond the tales told in Greece and Rome. So I think here of the work of Nancy de Drummond on Etruria, and in Phoenician-speaking contexts of Carolina Lopez Ruiz, Manolo Alvarez, and Giuseppe Garbati. So in this lecture, I examine another case in an emerging dossier of constitutional myth-making across the Mediterranean, as well as the ways in which these local myths feed into the more canonical stories still told of Rome itself. And in order to do so, what you're letting yourselves in for, I first need to review the case that I and others have made in the past, that the story of Dido's foundation of Carthage that survives in Greco-Roman accounts is based on a myth that Carthaginians told about their own origins, not just a story that others told about them. And my own suggestion that this myth supported the expansion of Carthaginian Empire across the Western Mediterranean. But I'll then turn to explore how the treatment of intermarriage, in particular in the legend, might make particular sense of the colonial experience of Carthaginians in Africa itself. I'll then look at what happens to the story in the Roman era, how much remains of the Carthaginian legend in Trogus' Augustan period version, and how much might be informed instead by Roman intermediaries and the lived experience of contemporary Roman settlers in Africa. And then, fourthly and finally, I'll discuss the ways in which Vergil's more extensive trope of the trope of intermarriage transforms Dido's story into a Roman political myth. So, starting at the beginning, the first thing to say is that Carthage has two different foundation legends. So, the first surviving story comes from Philistus of Syracuse, writing in the early 4th century BCE, who says simply that the city was founded by two Tyrians named Azoros and Carchedon, a generation before the Trojan War. Of course, the names of the founders given here are just the names of the two cities involved. Tyre, Phoenician Sor, meaning rock, and Carthage, Kartadasht in Greek Karkedon, which means new city. So this story is an etymological game set in a kind of fantastical era. But the second story, this story, this is the one I'll be talking about today, it's very different. So our earliest evidence for it is from another Sicilian historian writing about a century after Philistos, so in the early 3rd century BCE, Timaios of Tauromenium. And it survives not in his own words, but as it was later summarized in an anonymous, undated Greek work entitled On Women Intelligent and Courageous in Warfare, probably by a later copyist. And this is a wonderful document. It's a set of 14 very short stories about powerful women. And it can be dated to the later Hellenistic period on the basis of the sources it cites, as well as the catalogue genre of the work itself. And what we're interested in here is the entry in that collection under Theoso, a Greek nickname for the Tyrian woman, who Timaios says here was known in Phoenician as Elissa. And when this woman's brother, King Pygmalion, killed her husband, so Timaios' story goes, she fled the city by sea with some other citizens and travelled with great hardships to Libya, where the locals gave her a different nickname, Dido, or the Wanderer. And in Libya, she founded the city of Carthage, but then she refused to marry the local king. And when her own citizens insisted, she pretended to be preparing a ritual to free herself of her pledges to her late husband, but in reality built her own funeral pyre and then threw herself from her new palace to a fiery death. And this is the basic tale at the heart of all accounts we have of Dido's foundation of Carthage. And although later versions add a great deal more context and detail, I want to start from the version that we know was already in circulation before the Punic Wars. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about the origins of this legend, especially in French scholarship, with some suggesting that it is fundamentally a Greek or even Roman tale. The notion that it has, at the very least, an authentically Punic core, as Corinne Bonnet puts it in 2011, is now, however, the communis opinio. And I've discussed how this story was told at Carthage itself and in other Phoenician cities, and that was an easy thing to do because more than one ancient author tells us so. So Appian of Alexandria's History of Libya begins with a discussion of the foundation of Carthage that combines elements of both the earlier versions. Phoenicians settled Carthage in Libya 50 years before the capture of Troy. Its founders were either Zoros and Carchedon, or, as the Romans and the Carthaginians themselves think, Dido, a Tyrian woman whose husband had secretly been slain by Pygmalion, the ruler of Tyre. Then, according to Josephus, the story of Dido was also known at Tyre as well as Carthage. So he reproduces a briefer version of the same tale within a lengthy Tyrian king list taken from the Hellenistic historian Menander of Ephesus, who he says used Tyrian archives. In the 7th year of Pygmalion's reign, his sister fled and founded the city of Carthage. And Josephus explicitly calls this king list the testimony given by the Phoenicians. And while that doesn't, of course, mean that it was a genuine document, Josephus also reproduces dubious correspondence supposedly filed in the Tyrian archives between King Hiram of Tyre and King Solomon. It is, on the face of it, a Phoenician story. Beyond that, Pompeius Trogus, preserved in Justin, also suggests that a foundation story involving Dido was current at Tyre by the later 4th century BCE. So he reports that under siege from Alexander in 332, Tyrian spirits were lifted by the example of Dido, who, having founded Carthage, conquered a third of the world. Of course, feelings are easier to invent than facts and dates, and Trogus is writing considerably after the fact, among other hesitations one might have about his witness there. But we do have supporting evidence for pride in the example of Dido from Carthage itself. So, for one thing, Elishat was a common name at Carthage, about 40 attestations from the 4th to 2nd centuries. For another, Roman authors claim that she was worshipped as a goddess in the city after her death. Silius Italicus, for what it's worth, even describes a temple of Alyssa Genetrix down to her sweating marble cult statue. Now, the arrival of the name Alyssa in the epigraphic record in the 4th century doesn't give us a date, of course, for the arrival of her legend, or indeed her cult, in Carthage. Almost all surviving Carthaginian inscriptions are, in fact, from the Hellenistic period, so it just reflects that fact about the survival of the evidence. But there is one suggestion that she acquired new significance in Carthaginian self-presentation in the later 4th century. And that is the appearance, around 320 BCE, or a little later perhaps, of silver tetradrachms issued by Carthage in Sicily, showing an elegant woman wearing a pleated headdress, variously described in the catalogues as a Phrygian or Oriental tiara. Now, admittedly, this woman isn't actually labelled on the coin, but Greek colonies in this period already depicted their founders, so 5th and 4th century coinage shows that, and they depict both humans and sort of semi-divine figures. And this seems the most straightforward explanation for this woman who appears now and never again and never in any other context on these coins. So certainly nobody has ever come up with a convincing alternative identification. And it fits in with a reading of Dido's story in terms of contemporary imperial ideology at Carthage. So whether or not Dido was actually invented around the 4th century BCE, this is when she became useful as part of a network of connections and ideas that allowed the Carthaginians to present the expansion of their own power into the Western Mediterranean, not as hostile encroachment on the lands of other states, but as a rediscovery of ancient kinship in a shared Tyrian community, a shared Tyrian diasporic community. So, just to give you a couple of examples, hold on, there we are, Koine of Melkart. So the 4th century is when the first evidence appears for a privileged set of relationships and mutual obligations between a set of powerful Phoenician-speaking settlements across the Mediterranean and, and above all, Tyre, Carthage, Utica, and Gadir. And these cities participate in a shared mythscape of interconnected foundation stories, all involving Tyre, most involving Melkart, the patron god of Tyre, as well as a variety of kinship claims between these cities that Manolo Alvarez has traced in great detail, and he has labelled the whole network the Koine of Melkart. And within that, we can see at Carthage itself a new interest in Tyre in general in this period, and a new interest in Melkart, the Tyrian god, who appears on silver tetradrachms minted again in Sicily for about a decade, around 300 BCE. And these depict on their obverse a head of Heracles that must, in this context, have been understood as Melkart, since the equivalence between these two gods was by now well established. And on the other side, they depict a horse and a palm tree, which are extremely interesting in their own right, but not what I'll discuss in this lecture. If anyone has got any ideas about the horse in particular, I'd love to know. So the Koine of Melkart network can also be traced to the 5th and 4th centuries in diplomatic terms through the treaties made between Carthage and Rome. So the earliest, dated plausibly by Polybius to 509 BCE, mentions only Carthage and its allies as parties to the agreement, but in its 4th century renewal, the Uticans and Tyrians and all of their allies are listed alongside Carthage. So there's something changes in this period in particular, and that's what I would add to the arguments of Manolo Alvarez, who himself doesn't attempt to actually date the beginnings of this network or its sort of prime. But I have suggested elsewhere that the most plausible context is Carthaginian imperial expansion over other Phoenician-speaking lands. And this is a period that we can now trace with confidence from the late 5th century, and which had succeeded to the extent that by 264 BCE, let's get another. There we are. This is basically the hatched area here is the sort of extent of Carthaginian empire in the Western Mediterranean. Some of it hegemonic, you might say, but quite a lot of it territorial and taxation-based. And so by 264, Polybius could report that the Carthaginians had not only subjected Africa, but many parts of Iberia as well, and that they had also taken possession of all the islands in the Sardinian and Tyrrhenian seas, and that they were in control of almost all of Sicily. So the Koine of Melkart provides historical justification in this era for Carthage's contemporary power in the Western Mediterranean, and Dido is, I would argue, an important symbol within it. But what I want to turn to now is what the story of Dido meant on a more local level, and what it can tell us about colonial as well as imperial ideas. So Dido's story may have been invented at Carthage, but it did not emerge in isolation from the wider world of Mediterranean myth. So indeed, it displays many features typical of archaic Greek foundation stories. So a heroic but human founder figure, a strong focus on the narrative of departure, the journey, the acts of settlement and conquest, and the first generation. The founder as refugee from their home city is a theme in Greek stories too. The Parthenai left Sparta to found Tarentum because they were denied civic rights at home. Archias of Corinth founded Syracuse in order to avoid a state-sponsored murder charge. And we could perhaps go even further. The travels, trials, and wiliness of Dido the Wanderer recall the trickery and wanderings of one famous Greek hero in particular, Odysseus. And furthermore, the specific trick that Dido plays on her fellow citizens at the end of her story, pretending to be willing to remarry, but just in need of more time to prepare and to pay out existing commitments, recalls the trick played by Penelope on her suitors, where she pretends that she is unweaving a shroud for her father-in-law before she can remarry, but unpicks it every night. So it's hard to resist the idea, even from the brief summary of the story we have from Timaios, that what we have here is the amalgamation of the ultimate cunning couple into one heroic woman. But at the same time as the story of Dido exploits Greek mythical conventions, it also undermines them. So most obviously, in the Greek foundation myths, the founders are men. And by choosing a woman, the tellers of this Carthaginian tale remain outside Greek frameworks and expectations. I'd also suggest that they confront a long-standing Greek stereotype of Phoenicians as unusually deceitful. So Dido tricks her own citizens into permitting her suicide, but she does so in order to preserve an oath to her dead husband that she will not break. So wily she may be, but she dies for her faith and honour. Furthermore, the Carthaginian legend reverses a trick that Greek storytellers use from time to time of using intermarriage, often with local princesses, as a metaphor for the successful implantation of a colony. So, there we are. This discursive move is most closely associated with Carthage's greatest rival for maritime power in the Western Mediterranean, Massalia, supposedly founded by a pair of Phocaean Greek sailors who happened upon a marriage competition run by a local king for the hand of his daughter. And when one of them won that competition, the new city was their wedding present. The Carthaginian story, however, is quite the reverse of this. So Dido's tragic story revolves around her rejection of a marriage proposal from the local king of the Libyans, as Timaios puts it. When she was compelled by the citizens to comply, she pretended that she had to perform a certain rite to dissolve her oaths. She prepared and lit a great pyre near her palace and threw herself from the house into the fire, is the way he puts it. Now, intermarriage and the hybridity that results was a subject of fascination to 19th century Europeans, with the classic text on this being Robert Young's 1995 work, Colonial Desire, an exploration of colonialism as a desiring machine, with unlimited appetite for territorial expansion, growth, and self-reproduction, a situation that, as Young puts it, produced its own darkest fantasy, the unlimited and ungovernable fertility of unnatural unions. But in antiquity as well as modernity, notions of mixed marriage operated both as justifications for territorial appropriation, as in the Greek tradition, and as what we might now call racecraft. The crossing of community boundaries reinforces the notion of those boundaries themselves and the belief in difference that they represent. But still, the story of Dido is unusually stark in its straightforward rejection of that hybridity. This is an even stronger construction of difference than is usual in these kinds of stories. So, what I would suggest is that Dido's rejection of an African king in this story suggests a rejection not only of Greek stereotypes, which we can see in various other ways as well, but also of a local African strand to her city's history. This assertion of Tyrian purity at the origin of the city, at the expense of a half-African past, fits in then again with the self-presentation of 4th century Carthage, not as an African power, but as part of a maritime network of Tyrian colonies. But I'd also suggest that it fits in with a newly hierarchical and more immediately colonial relationship that Carthage has in Africa itself in the 4th century. So the way this works historically is that after centuries where the city of Carthage looked almost entirely out to sea, coexisting but not closely collaborating with local powers and interests, territorial expansion began in the late 5th century in Africa itself. There we are. Okay. So by 397, Africa was able to conscript local Libyan forces to fight in Sicily. During the First Punic War, Carthage doubled the standard taxes on Libyan towns. And by 218, Polybius tells us, the Carthaginians controlled North Africa from the altars of Philinus between Cyrene and Tripoli to the Pillars of Hercules on the Atlantic. And we get a sense of the profits involved in this control from a slightly later story. According to Livy, the cities of Tripolitania owed Carthage enormous taxes in the early 2nd century, with Lepkis alone paying a talent a day in 193 BCE. But what of colonization itself, of settlement in Africa in this period beyond the city of Carthage? Well, here the evidence dries up. So it's close to impossible, of course, to identify the political status of a city or a small village even from its archaeological remains alone. This hasn't stopped some scholars building elaborate networks of colonial settlement in Africa and elsewhere on the part of Carthage, but on the evidence alone of Roman period political arrangements and terminology. But even without the confidence that some of my colleagues have on this point, there are some clues. Oh, going to get there. There we go. So there's not a lot we can do with Strabo's claim that the Phoenicians had 300 poleis in Libya, nor is it clear that Carthaginian concern to prevent the foundation of Greek-speaking colonies on the coast of Africa and elsewhere in the 6th century BCE was in the service of any colonial programme of its own. The fascinating Greek account of the colonial expedition, the colonial settlement expedition to the Atlantic coast of Africa, attributed to the Carthaginian general Hanno in the 6th or 5th century, can at best reassure us that Carthaginian colonization was within the realm of possible conjecture of at least later scholars. But Aristotle tells us in the 4th century that at Carthage, a portion of the demos, where in context he's pointing to the less wealthy members of the community, are always sent out upon the cities, as he says, epitas polis, making matters at Carthage itself, he claims, more stable. And he later adds that this also enriches the settlers themselves, who are now in these surrounding territories. Now, the wording makes it sound as if these people are sent to existing local cities rather than entirely new foundations. But either way, the phenomenon of widespread agricultural settlement in newly conquered territory would make sense of the fame of the Carthaginian agricultural writer Mago, whose work was translated into Latin by the Roman Senate after the conquest of the African city in order to aid their own exploitation of the territory. So this brings us to Rome, and the third part of my talk. The final destruction of Carthage in 146 came after 3 years of Roman siege. Then the city rose again as a colony, refounded by Julius Caesar a century after Roman soldiers had left it in ruins. But my question here is, what happened to Dido in this later period? Can we disentangle later Roman additions to her story from fuller Roman accounts of the Carthaginian version than survives of Timaios? So one longer version of... Don't worry about what this says yet. One longer version of Dido's story is found in Justin's 2nd century CE epitome of the universal history that Pompeius Trogus compiled in the Augustan period. And it appears to preserve in fantastic detail what is still very largely the Carthaginian version. And I think it can tell us more about colonial discourse in 4th century Carthage. And apologies for showing you slabs of text for a few slides here, but I've underlined the sections I'm going to talk about, and I hope that will make them easier to pick out. So, much of the additional detail that we find in the summary of Trogus serves simply to fill out what we already knew from the much briefer summary of Timaios' version, suggesting that it's based on the same story, if not exactly necessarily the same source. So, in section 4, for instance, we find out that Dido was not only Pygmalion's sister, but was supposed to be his co-ruler until the citizenry insisted on sole rule by a man. So there was a political as well as personal reason for her unhappiness. And we also find out where the money that Timaios mentioned was from, which is to say her wealthy husband Archabas. And we also find out at the end of section 4 what Dido did with that money, pretending to throw it overboard on her way out of Tyre's harbour, and we find out more about her companions in flight, so senators, so apparently fellow political discontents. And we find Melkart here too, here of course called Hercules, whose priest it turns out Archabas had been, and whose sacred objects accompany Dido on her flight. And so this also all fits in very nicely with the increasing interest in Melkart in 4th century Carthage. But this sense of filling in details left out of the very brief summary and on women continues throughout the rest of the account, along with a variety of other indications of this tale's origins in the Phoenician-speaking world, or more specifically, I would suggest in Carthage itself. So the Phoenician name of Akabas or Zakabal or Hasdrubal, for instance. And here in section 5, discussion of the distinctly Levantine institution of sacred prostitution, which is not essential to the plot. Later in the section, kinsmen from Utica appear to help the new arrivals as well, which again suggests a context in the Koine of Melkart. But another new detail in Trogus' version adds texture to that imperial ideology, adds local texture, which is, coming back to the section where sacred prostitution is mentioned, but what this is in the context of is an episode on the journey where Dido makes landfall on Cyprus, where she collects a local priest along with his wife and children and abducts 80 young women who have been practicing some form of ritual prostitution on the beach. So that, Justin or Trogus says, so that her young men might have wives and her city a posterity. So this not only underlines Carthaginian power and agency in the broader Tyrian Mediterranean, but the acquisition of Levantine women seems entirely in line with the Queen's own rejection of intermarriage with an African king in both versions of the story. And it's interesting here that it's presented by Trogus as very much her own decision. So far, all of this suggests that what we have here is a version of the same Carthaginian story that was told by Timaios, and that it tells a similar story about local colonial ideology as well as wider imperial ideology. And we don't know how many of these additional elements were already in Timaios' original version before it was epitomised, but the two stories are entirely compatible until we get to the precise details of the Queen's death at the end of section 6, at the end here, where in Trogus' version she dies by the sword rather than by fire. But there is more to it. In addition to some signs of interference from Greek traditions in Trogus' version that I don't have room to address here in detail, some aspects of Trogus' story could result from Roman reinterpretation. So it's interesting, for instance, that in an early section he identifies the leading Carthaginians who in his version tricked Dido into agreeing to marry the African king, not as Timaios' generic citizens, but specifically as senators, perhaps reflecting contemporary Roman views of the Carthaginian Senate as treaty breakers during the Punic Wars. And furthermore, the characterization of the local Africans by these settlers as animal-like barbarians, here in section 6, this is when they're talking to Dido, persuading her to attempt to civilize the local king. This characterization of these animal-like barbarians who are quite literally asking for civilization just doesn't sound very Phoenician. There's no echo in the little we know of Phoenician ideas of this sort of civilizational mission ideology. But it is found in at least some Roman imperial discourse and famously mocked by Tacitus. To Roman readers, however, the big complication is that Carthaginians are now just Roman subjects too. So I think it's all the more striking in that respect that on Trogus' account, the local population joins the new settlement of Carthage and even petition for Tyrian Dido to stay. So let's see if I can get the right place here. Here we are. The neighbouring peoples flooded in, bringing with them many goods to sell to the foreigners in the hope of making money and establish their homes there. And this comes before the people from Utica arrive, even. And according to Trogus, Carthage was founded in the end by the consent of all. And the new city paid an annual tribute to the Libyans for the land and attracted many of the surrounding peoples. Now, this story is, of course, curiously reminiscent of the foundation story of Rome itself, where many people come together from the surrounding area to make the new settlement work, some more voluntarily than others. It's also a strikingly positive account of colonial interaction that sits somewhat uncomfortably with Dido's abduction of Cypriot wives for her men in the previous section, which should essentially have solved the same problem, and her own rejection of intermarriage in the next section. So I'd suggest that this part of the story makes most sense as a Roman addition to a Carthaginian story that had highlighted instead the support provided by the Tyrian Uticans, partners in the coinage of Melkart. And the anecdote emphasises the weakness of Rome's rival Carthage in its early history, paying for the privilege of occupying African land, and above all, it aligns the Phoenician settlers with the African population. And this, I would suggest, makes particular sense in the late 1st century BCE, where in addition to the earlier seizure of huge agricultural estates by the Romans and the imposition of taxation on the local population, Romans were themselves, for the first time, settling in vast numbers. So this is a map of Caesarian and Augustan colonization, and you can see that there is a great deal of activity on the coast of Africa in that rather brief period. And these new settlers came not just to Carthage itself and to subordinate settlements in Carthage's own immediate territory, but there are well over 30 other Julian and Augustan veteran colonies on good farmland or along the coast. And in many cases, again, these veterans were settled in existing communities, rather awkwardly, making the occupation intensely personal. And this was the first significant Roman settlement in the region at all, and I would suggest that it was at least as much of a contemporary context for Augustan authors writing about Africa as the earlier civil war against Antony and Cleopatra would have been. Now, there are plenty of other versions in Latin literature of the Dido story, but the last thing I want to talk about in any detail is the one told by Trogus' Augustan period contemporary, Vergil, which develops this theme of intermarriage and hybridity in new directions. So, Vergil's poem combines, not for the first time, aspects of Dido's story with the tale of the minor Trojan hero Aeneas, making her into a woman that he loves and leaves during a stopover on the African coast on his way to found Rome. Now, this is the only entirely new element in Vergil's account of Dido's backstory, as far as we can tell from what's left of what went before, is a ghostly appearance of her husband Acabas to her in a dream. But Vergil sets her African story in a very distinctively Roman chronology, I think for the first time. So it's obvious and well known that the Carthage that he describes her as building, with its theatre and its great temple of Juno, is in fact the later Roman colony that had just in fact been built. Now, in general, of course, and in some ways, Vergil's portrayal of Dido is very positive. He makes her more sympathetic than Aeneas, certainly the more effective leader. She's the one who has succeeded in founding a city while Aeneas is still floundering around the Mediterranean, even if their romance does stop building work. She is, however, a less resourceful character in this than in earlier versions. So, in Vergil's retelling, it's Pygmalion who tricks Dido, not as in Trogus' account the other way round. And then in planning her flight, Vergil's Dido is doing as her husband tells her in this dream, not actually thinking for herself, as in the earlier version. In fact, almost all her tricks have vanished in Vergil's account. She is, for the most part, the passive victim or agent of others' plans and destiny. And her cunning is shown really only, I think, in the preparations for her death, which leaves her city and her sister devastated. But the point that I want to make here is that although Vergil, like Trogus, cannot ignore the refusal of intermarriage with the king he calls Iarbas, because it was a core element of the original Carthaginian story, he introduces not one but two more mixed marriages to the tale that between them tell a rather different story. So, obviously the second one is the failed marriage between Dido and Aeneas, where it's Dido now who's the barbarian other to Aeneas' proto-Roman, emphasising the similarity of the position of Africans and Carthaginians in the new political order. And the failure of the marriage between the Carthaginian queen and the Trojan soldier involves not only the alignment of the indigenous population and the Tyrian settlers in Africa itself, as in Trogus' tale of an intermingled community, but rejection of an African strand to Rome's own story as well. And then there's the third story of intermarriage. And this one, of course, is a success, the union of Trojan Aeneas and Latin Lavinia. And like the stories that undergird the foundation of Massalia and other Greek-speaking colonies in the Mediterranean, this is the acceptable transracial love story that produces Rome itself and is underlined in the Roman perspective that is repeated, if not necessarily endorsed, throughout the Aeneid, as when Anchises tells Aeneas in the underworld of the glories that will come from Trojan and Italian stock. It also involves a direct rejection of Dido's counter-offer in Book 1 of a Trojan-Tyrian alliance in Libya. There we are. Would you care to join us in this realm on equal terms, she says. The city I build is yours. Haul up your ships. Trojan and Tyrian will all be one to me. And it also involves the assertion by the new Romans of their own Eurasian worldview over a Carthaginian one put into Dido's words that includes her portion of Africa as well within the bounds of the sun's path. We are not so oblivious, we Phoenicians. The sun yokes his team within our range at Carthage. Instead, Rome is a creation here of Europe and Asia. Africa is figured as a blank space beyond them, outside the known world of shared heritage, as when Aeneas describes himself to his mother as an exile from Europe and Asia, wandering the deserts of Libya. I could carry on, of course. There are other Didos in other Latin texts. As I say, the theme of intermarriage plays out in other ways. There's also the fascinating medieval Icelandic legend of Ord the Deep-Minded, which in its own way reverses what I've treated here as Phoenician myth, in the same way I think the Phoenician myth often reverses Greek myth. So as I'm sure you all know, Ord is the wife of the Norwegian king of Dublin in the 9th century. And after his death, she secretly builds a ship that she then captains on a journey from Scotland via Orkney and the Faroes to Iceland, where she founds her own settlement with the help of Norwegian kin. But instead of picking up women along the way to take with her, however, she leaves them behind, marrying off female relatives to local rulers en route. But that's another story. So for now, I'll leave Dido where she belongs, and thank you all very much. Yes, please. I love questions.
Thank you, Josephine, for the fantastic talk. My question is about marriage and anxieties around marriages and the joining of families. It's something that comes up a lot in kind of thinking about women's history more generally, that there's this idea of a woman entering a marital home as being kind of other always. And I wonder about how that feeds into the colonial narratives and the role that marriage again plays within that.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. Of course, you're absolutely right. But these stories somehow manage to avoid it. So Dido turns up having left all her family behind, except for her sister. And the person that she is marrying in all the stories, not marrying, in all the stories, the African king, is not given his own family. He has sort of followers and things, but he's not kind of given a sort of deep characterization in that way. And in fact, the only version of this, I suppose, yes, there's, Aeneas has sort of minimal family again, but that isn't emphasised in the story. But I suppose it's only when Aeneas marries Lavinia that it's clear he's really marrying into a family. And there it's him marrying into the Italian family and so on. And that is, I think, emphasised kind of strongly. So that's a really interesting point. But I suppose one of the things that I'm curious about in these stories is the way that immediate family often plays a kind of secondary role to the sort of colonial families involved, the idea of fellow settlers at Carthage and Utica, that the idea that Cyprus is somehow these women are part of the family that Carthage is part of, in a way that the African women aren't, and so on. So it's almost a sort of kind of more extended and less personal notion of kinship in these particular stories, I would say.
I just find it so striking that there's this contrast between Dido as a woman founding a colony and what happens with these men going to places and founding colonies and being able to make those successful marriages.
Yeah.
And it seems like her gender must play a role in why that narrative is the way it is.
Right, and that brings up a kind of real, let's not say problem, let's say kind of outstanding issue with the argument I've been making, which is that, of course, although Dido herself objects to the marriage with the Iarbas, her male citizens, the scientists who've come with her, are encouraging her to do it. And it's not something that we're explicitly told they're doing themselves, but that would be a very easy deduction to make from Trogus' story, certainly. So yes, perhaps that's actually a really interesting point, that perhaps her gender kind of doesn't allow that story to play out in the way that it can in the Greek and I would say actually Roman versions too. Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. What else? Yes.
I'll stand up to be heard better. Hi, this is really fascinating. Thank you so much. I'm interested both by what you were tracing with the sort of Carthaginian story and then with the Roman reception of it. And I want to ask about the latter. So specifically, I would love to hear maybe a little more of your thoughts on why this story retained its power for the Roman audience in the Augustan era. So maybe in Vergil, it's more straightforwardly a project of legitimating this new settlement. Do we see that in Trogus? Are there other sorts of motivations that we might see in Trogus for why the story would be taken up by the Romans instead of maybe a different sort of foundational or refoundational narrative?
That's great, yeah. So I think one of the differences is that in Vergil's version, this is a very central part of his story. That, without Dido, I don't think really the Aeneid would work, or at least we wouldn't read it as much. Whereas, of course, with Trogus, he's telling, as far as we can tell from Justin's epitome, he's telling the stories of all the interesting stories he can find about the Mediterranean. So I do think that certain Roman and indeed Greek aspects or kind of versions creep into that. I don't think it's as considered, either by Trogus or Justin, just because the main point of it within this work is to be another great story he knows that nobody else knows in such elaborate and fascinating detail. But I do think that even if we don't think that Trogus himself would have the kind of ideological interest in any of his individual stories, and I may be absolutely underestimating him there, that doesn't mean that they don't actually reflect ideas that are around at the time. And, they're really very closely contemporary, Trogus and Vergil. And so I think it's hard to get away from the idea that the new colony of Carthage, which is so intensely meaningful at the time, founded exactly 100 years after the city was destroyed. I mean, it becomes the kind of, type city for African the African kind of settlement program, and perhaps even the kind of more general Mediterranean settlement program. It's certainly the most famous. One of the lovely details about the Roman foundation of Carthage, the sort of refoundation of Carthage, is that the city is mapped out to be much, much larger than it actually ever became, let alone than it really was at the beginning. So, you can see in the original kind of city plan that there are streets that are kind of accounted for that are never actually built over 3 or 4 centuries of this being one of the most important cities in the Mediterranean, the Roman Mediterranean. So I think that the importance of Carthage and the Roman colony of Carthage in the kind of colonial, the sort of contemporary colonial myth making would be very hard to avoid for any of these authors. But yeah, I sort of my instinct is that Vergil is actively doing more with it one way or another, but that may just be my own centuries of conditioning speaking there. Yes.
Hi, my question also has to do with marriage, and I really like what you were saying about Dido and Aeneas' failed marriage, and hopefully this doesn't take us too far away from Carthage, but I was wondering what you thought about the failed marriage between Turnus and Lavinia, and what does that say?
No, that's a great point. Yeah, that really is a kind of reversal. And I wonder if here the gender point comes back in again, that in a way, I suppose I'd like these stories to have a lot of kind of agency of undermining existing stories and be very playful, but it may be that, in fact, the kind of gender dynamics are actually harder to resist than my version would like. But yes, no. Yes. Well, I guess in fact I should say that there are 4 intermarriage episodes, not just 3. Once you go a little bit away from Carthage, and that 4th one does indeed kind of tell the same story as the others. Yeah. Thank you. Yes. Sure.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. This is in some ways a question about method, I guess, but also about marriage, which is you use the word mythscape, which I thought was a really kind of wonderful tag, and you're toggling here between historical sources and then an epic poem, one that is riffing in many ways on questions of myth while producing its own myth, right? And so I'm just wondering about the sort of disentangling that you're trying to perform here between an epic poem that is grounding itself in myth, creating a new myth for Rome, and the sort of effort to try to reconstruct a kind of history before, right? And alongside that, the kind of missing figure for me is Cleopatra, right? The most obvious and immediate figure, the kind of problematic intermarriage of Antony and Cleopatra, and how does that stand as a kind of interracial, non-Roman sort of colonial symbol? And in what sense is that being read back once again, or rather is the myth-making associated with the Cleopatra problem forcing Dido to be conflated back into Africa out of her sort of Tyrian origin? So just thinking about the various dimensionalities of the problem of myth here.
Yeah, so I mean, I sort of deliberately avoided Cleopatra in this talk just because so much has been written about that particular kind of version of intermarriage and racecraft around that interpretation. I did manage to convince myself as I was writing this that actually, although the story of Cleopatra and Antony is very close to modern interpretations of this, that in fact that was in fact a previous generation when these stories are being written, whereas the contemporary settler colonialism is happening right now, right here, or rather right there, to people's, brothers, uncles, sisters, all the rest of it. It's on such a large scale across the Mediterranean, but a very large portion of it being in North Africa, apart from Egypt, in the Julian and Augustan periods, particularly Augustan, in fact, that I feel like it can't avoid being the first reference point over this woman who clearly is, also very important in the Roman imagination. Is undoubtedly that, is part of certainly what Vergil is up to, and probably Trogus too. But I think in itself, I suppose I kind of want to get away from not only the kind of great man, but also the kind of great women aspects of history to what people are actually experiencing when they're telling these stories. And that's what comes back to the mythscape thing. So I should say that I have borrowed the term mythscape from Duncan Bell, who uses it in much more contemporary context. But I think for me, one of the important aspects of the way that these legends, if you like, are working, not just in terms of the Dido story, but also I've written in the past about the story of the Fellaini brothers, also foundation stories about Gadir and so on, is as that creating history in that way, actively, so even consciously creating history, is something that we should be taking more seriously, rather than, I worry, I suppose, that the term sort of myth and legend kind of, for us, put it off into this other sort of world of these are the stories we tell, whereas in reality it's like this. But I think, as we know from the world today, those things are actually, there isn't really a boundary for most of us in sort of day-to-day lived experience between the stories that we tell as history and the stories that we tell as consciously stories. And so for me, mythscape is a term that brings out the variegated storytelling relationships and networks in the Mediterranean, more than just the idea of, say, Greek myth or indeed Carthaginian myth or something. But at the same time, that term myth in itself is perhaps even too loaded to use of antiquity, because I don't think these stories are being told as consciously untrue stories.
Yeah. The question is more directed at that term myth, because in some ways it triangulates the literary and the historical, which sort of flow into each other. And I'm curious about your commitment, I guess, to that triangulation as opposed to letting those things.
Yeah, no, I think I am committed to that triangulation, but I'm not committed to the idea that that boundary between literature and history is meaningful to any of the tellers of these stories, I suppose. Yeah. The history is a very modern idea, I guess is what I'm saying. Yes.
I want to address the sort of middle two sections of the talk and the connection between the sort of pieces, the narrative pieces from which the Dido story is constructed, connection between those and then what we find in the classical sources. So this looks a lot like Penelope, and this looks a lot like what we hear about when we're founding Greek colonies by people who are sort of one step ahead of the sheriff and this kind of thing. And I just wonder if so we as classicists, and I think it's fair to say we are classicists, we know our ancient literature so well, and we're able to say, oh, this aspect of the story looks like this mythy, we'll say, from the stories that we know, and therefore it must trace its origins back. If that's also not a kind of colonizing move, it's in essence the interpretatio romana or interpretatio graeca of these stories is us imposing the interpretive framework that we're comfortable with on the basis of where we sit as thinkers and scholars onto this material. And I just wonder if there's any, obviously we're getting our Hellenized or Latinized versions of these stories. So we're automatically should be inclined to do this interpretatio Romana or interpretatio Graeca. But that said, if there's any hope of recovering something that we could think of as an indigenous Carthaginian story, Alicia is a perfectly good Semitic name, something like God is my oath or something. And so there are, and you have shown that there are elements in the coinage and so forth where we can just pick up little traces of the culture that Rome essentially wiped out. Is there any, and Josephus, also Pompeius Trogus, claim to have access to Semitic language sources? Any hope we can get at that, or are we stuck with an interpretatio Romana?
Oh no, I think that is my fundamental argument here. These are Carthaginian stories. Instead, I suppose what I'm looking at is for the tiny signs within them of Greek, in particular Greek stories that show kind of interaction in the storytelling networks of the Mediterranean. So for me, the story of Dido is absolutely primarily a Semitic myth, full stop, and with some indications in some versions of some Roman interference and some indication in the basic version of a familiarity with other Mediterranean stories as well, that I think comes out in other Carthaginian myths, like the story of the Fellaini brothers and so on. So on the one hand, I suppose my mission here is exactly to recuperate those local myths, or local from a kind of Greco-Roman perspective, those other myths of the Western Mediterranean. But I think but what I want to kind of also bring out is that nobody is telling stories purely in one tradition. Of course, you can do this with Homer just as easily and sort of pick out all the bits and pieces that are coming from other traditions and so on. So when I pick out the bits that I think are playing with Greek ideas, is to say that this is a world where people are hearing and telling a lot of stories to each other. And I suppose my kind of vision of the first millennium BCE Mediterranean in this respect is close to what we know much better of the medieval Mediterranean, and indeed beyond, medieval sort of Afro-Eurasia, where the extraordinary stories that like Balaam and Josaphat, like Kalila Dimna, like all these incredible kind of, what have been called story networks, sort of move between cultures and are retold in all sorts of different contexts. And in Balaam and Josaphat, the story of the Buddha becomes a story about a Christian convert whose father disapproves of him, and so on. And you can really see at every stage, as the story gets translated into a different language, these new elements kind of come in, but the old elements are kind of played with and sometimes retained. Sometimes, if they're really important for the story, you have to have family disapproval in that story, but what is disapproval of doesn't matter so much. And the way that often, as these things get translated into Greek or Georgian or Hebrew or Latin from originally Sanskrit, Persian, Arabic, you sort of get biblical stories kind of slip into the collection here and there. And so that really, I suppose that's the model that I'm thinking along. But of course, we have so much more evidence from the medieval period to actually, you can really see it in action. You can see the translations going on and so on. And we don't have as much evidence for the ancient Mediterranean, but I do think we get bits and pieces. I mean, the sort of mentions of daughters hearing stories from their mothers, of enslaved caregivers telling children stories from their own traditions and so on. You get these little moments where you can see it, and where you see, the enormous trading connections, for instance, between Athens and Carthage in the 5th century. I mean, those, of course, are all involving individuals who are meeting each other and no doubt telling stories some of the time too. So I think it's what I want to bring out is the extent to which all of these stories are dependent on so many other stories, I suppose, while also developing specific traditions and ideas and ideologies of their own at the same time. And certainly I do want to kind of claim the story of Dido for the Phoenician tradition. Pauline.
So thank you for the lecture. This huge amount of sources. It was impressive. And I guess that my question is again about marriage and weddings. And trying to see them rather as a cultural problem and not a gender problem in this myth. Because we see this Carthaginian myth through the lens of Romans and Greeks, as you've shown. And the way in which Vergil presents the story and Dido, the problem that these two marriages caused to Dido, which end up with her killing herself, both the previous one and the failed one. I guess that for all Romans were indeed a problem on her behalf, something that she did wrong. But when it comes to the second section of your talk, and when we see especially with the second marriage, we have this man telling her you should marry this new king. But what she chooses to do is rather the opposite, and she kills herself again. But I wonder if this part of those men asking her to marry the man is rather a Greek or Roman lens that we are obliged to use. Because she ends up being the hero of the story, being the founder of the city, being on coin, a temple of, if she really was Didogenetrix, it's a temple of the founder as the hero of the city. So it's hard for me to see her doing something wrong in the original myth.
So, I've been really torn about that particular bit of the story when the men tell her what to do and she says no and kills herself instead. And yeah, absolutely, that is part of her heroism in the Phoenician version. What's actually going on there? Are we seeing a sort of Romanized version of it, which on the one hand, absolutely could work and would, work very nicely in a lot of ways, very tempting. But I do think that there's also a possibility in which these guys are simply bad guys in the story. That they are lying all the way through. Again, that could make them, part of, more in that case, a sort of Greek version of Phoenicians. But it's very clear in Trogus' story that they make up this very elaborate thing about how the king wants someone to teach him Phoenician and generally culture and civilization and so on, but they were going to refuse to do it because it would be awful to hang out with these barbarian animals and so on, and sort of force her to say, no, you should do this. You should put the city and the peaceful relations with the neighbours before your own desire not to hang out with the Africans. And then they turn it around and say, well, in that case, you should marry the king, because that's what's really going on. So, they come across very, very badly in the story. It's hard to see how, it's not a happy story of the kind of reinscription of gender, gender power there. So I think I'm really still thinking, and will continue to think with these thoughts, thank you very much, about what the not what actually is happening there, but what the actual range of possibilities is there for just how much interference there is, or what actually is happening with the sort of multiple levels of deception. Thank you.
Just to build off that, the addition of the sword, I think, is quite a Roman echo.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Screams to me Lucretia.
Absolutely. So that's a bit of the lecture that got cut for time, but then there are some other, and there's a huge amount of Greek stuff in the story of the Beisa and things that only work in the Greek language in Trogus' story as well, which I didn't discuss. So there is a lot of interference, certainly, but how much of it is at the ideological level is the tricky question. Yeah.
Thank you so much. My question is about whether you can see or envision places in which these stories were coming together, a kernel of something Phoenician with, I think what you've just shown had a lot of Greek influence before the Italian tradition. Maybe it didn't have to be Carthage or North Africa, If you think about Sicily, where Phoenicians and Greeks were living side by side for centuries, and your oldest sources are Greek, actually.
Sicilian Greek.
Right. So can you think about where these stories might have historically been coming together with two communities and what that might have meant in those spaces?
Well, I think Sicily is definitely the most obvious place, not because I think that is where we can see the transmission of the Carthaginian story into the Greek tradition with both Philistus is a question of that one, but certainly with Timaios, you can see that. So I think Sicily is certainly, I think, that a very obvious initial point of contact. Where the versions that actually aren't just retelling these stories, if that's what Timaios is doing, and certainly in the version we have, there doesn't seem to be anything added to the very basic Timaios story. But by the time it gets to someone like Trogus, you know, where is that story actually being told? Which, of course, you know, famously, it's one of the most difficult questions in Latin historical literature, we might say, is Trogus' sources, which, I mean, really, we have no idea most of the time where Trogus is getting what he's getting from. Again, I mean, Sicily, I mean, Diodorus is certainly one of the authors he's using, and even in this particular passage, it's probably one of the authors he's using. And so again, I mean, Sicily is and as one of the earliest kind of the province that Rome inherits from both the Phoenicians and the Greeks in the East, it would be a really interesting place for those kinds of games to be going on. So, yeah, I would be very surprised if Sicily wasn't very involved in all of this. I think it's actually much more likely than Carthage itself, well, partly because, you know, by the time you get to Trogus, there haven't been any Carthaginians at Carthage for 100 years, or longer, 120 years or something. So I think it's Sicily, and indeed, you know, Rome itself is another. So it's probably multiple places. As with the medieval kind of story networks, again, it's probably multiple places, especially ports, on multiple coasts. But yeah, Sicily is the hot spot. Thank you.
I know there are other questions. I have questions, but I think it is time to ask them over some wine, and it's time to thank Josephine for a wonderful talk.